If you ask a religious person why someone becomes an atheist, you'll usually get one of a few answers. They were hurt by the church. They wanted to live without consequences. They fell in with the wrong people. They were too proud to submit to something greater than themselves. They were confused by bad philosophy or bad science. And if you ask an atheist why they became one, you'll also get a familiar set of answers. They followed the evidence. They read the right books. They couldn't believe what they couldn't prove. They were brave enough to face the truth. Here's the problem with both of those accounts. The psychological research on religious deconversion, which is one of the most studied transitions in all of the psychology of religion, tells a substantially different story than either side tends to prefer. The real reasons why people become atheists are more specific, more psychological, more human, and more complicated than any of the popular explanations suggest. And understanding them matters, not just for this debate, but for what they reveal about how human beings actually change their deepest beliefs about anything. I've spent years studying behavioral psychology and how people construct and reconstruct their worldviews. And the psychology of religious deconversion is one of the most interesting cases I've encountered, because it forces you to look honestly at a process that most people assume is primarily rational, but that turns out to be primarily emotional, relational, and social, with the intellectual arguments arriving mostly after the fact to explain a change that was already well underway. Today, we're going through the real reasons, the ones the research actually identifies. Some of them will make religious people uncomfortable. Some of them will make atheists uncomfortable. Good. That usually means we're getting closer to something accurate. Subscribe if you haven't already. This channel covers behavioral psychology in a way that takes it seriously rather than making it simple. Hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this content. Let's start with what the research on deconversion actually looks like as a field, because the methodology matters for understanding what the findings mean. Psychologists studying religious deconversion use several approaches: retrospective surveys where people describe their deconversion experience, longitudinal studies that follow people over time, in-depth qualitative interviews, and comparative studies between populations with different rates of religious change. What's consistent across all of these methods is something that challenges the dominant narrative from both sides. The process of becoming an atheist is almost never primarily intellectual, and it almost never happens quickly. It is typically a gradual, emotionally driven process that takes years, sometimes decades, and that the person often doesn't fully recognize as a process until they're already well into it. With that context, here are the real reasons. The first real reason, and the one that surprises people most because it seems almost too simple, is that the people around you change. Social belonging is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and religious belief is one of the most socially embedded forms of human cognition. People don't just hold religious beliefs in their heads. They hold them in communities, in relationships, in shared rituals and languages and identities. And when the social landscape around a person shifts, their beliefs often shift with it. The research on this is remarkably consistent. Studies of deconversion across multiple countries and religious traditions find that close relationships with non-believers, particularly romantic partners, close friends, and colleagues, are one of the strongest predictors of religious disengagement. Not because those non-believers are arguing people out of belief, though sometimes they do, but because the day-to-day experience of being in close relationship with someone who navigates life without religion, who has a coherent moral framework, who finds meaning and faces difficulty without God, gradually erodes the implicit assumption that religion is the only framework adequate to human life. This process is rarely conscious. The person doesn't sit down and think, "I have a non-religious friend, therefore I am reconsidering my theology." What happens instead is more diffuse. The social identity that was bound up with religious community gradually becomes less central. The relationships outside that community become more central. The sense that one's deepest beliefs must align with one's deepest relationships, which is a fundamental feature of human social psychology, creates a slow gravitational pull toward the worldview of the people one is closest to. This is not manipulation. It is how human cognition works. Beliefs are social objects. We hold them in relation to other people, not in isolation. And when the social context changes, the beliefs often follow. The second real reason is one that religious communities tend to acknowledge, but tend to frame as a failure of faith rather than as what the psychology suggests it actually is: the experience of unanswered prayer in a moment of genuine crisis. The research on this is nuanced and important. Most religious people have the experience of praying for something and not receiving what they prayed for. Most of them do not become atheists as a result. What distinguishes the cases where unanswered prayer contributes to deconversion from the cases where it doesn't is a specific combination of factors: the stakes of the prayer, the sincerity and sustained nature of it, and most importantly, the theological framework the person was operating within. People who were taught that prayer reliably produces concrete outcomes, that God specifically intervenes in response to sincere requests, that the failure of prayer implies either insufficient faith or divine plan, are significantly more vulnerable to deconversion when they pray desperately for something that doesn't come. Not because the theology is simple, but because the gap between what the theology promised and what the experience delivered creates a cognitive dissonance that is, for some people, not resolvable within the religious framework. The person prays for a child's recovery. The child dies. The explanation offered by the religious community, that God had a plan, that the suffering has meaning, that faith should not require favorable outcomes, can feel not just intellectually insufficient, but morally intolerable. And moral intolerance, it turns out, is a much more powerful driver of belief change than intellectual argument. The third real reason is moral disillusionment, and it is consistently one of the top-ranked factors in deconversion research across cultures and religious traditions. Moral disillusionment means the experience of watching the religious community or its leadership behave in ways that are fundamentally inconsistent with the values the community claims to hold. This can be large-scale, the documented, systematic cover-up of abuse within religious institutions that has been one of the defining religious stories of the last 3 decades. It can be personal and local, watching a respected religious leader treat vulnerable people with cruelty, or observing the community's response to someone who transgresses its norms, or experiencing firsthand the gap between the love and acceptance the community preaches and the conditional, hierarchical reality of how belonging actually works inside it. What makes moral disillusionment such a powerful driver of deconversion is that it operates at the level of values rather than beliefs. The person is not being argued out of their theology. They are experiencing a betrayal of the moral framework that made the theology feel worth holding, and values, the research consistently shows, are deeper and more motivating than beliefs. When the community that holds your theology violates the values that made the theology meaningful, the theology itself becomes suspect in a way that no philosophical argument could produce. The psychological mechanism here is what researchers call moral credentialing in reverse. We extend belief to sources whose moral credibility we trust. When the moral credibility of the source is destroyed, the beliefs associated with it become unstable in ways that are difficult to stabilize through purely intellectual means. You can't argue someone back into trusting an institution they've watched systematically harm the people it was supposed to protect. Now, at this point in the video, let me tell you about the Sharp Mind Blueprint, because understanding why people change their deepest beliefs, which is what we're really doing in this video, is exactly the kind of thinking it was built to sharpen. 7 evidence-based systems for thinking more clearly about complex, contested topics, including the ones that generate more heat than light. The QR code is on screen right now, and the link is in the description. If this kind of analysis is what you come to this channel for, that is the natural next step. The fourth real reason is one that tends to get the most pushback from both sides, and it requires some psychological precision to explain correctly. It is cognitive style, and specifically what happens when a person who is naturally high in analytic thinking is raised in an environment that requires them to suppress that tendency in relation to religious claims. We covered in a previous video on this channel the research showing that people higher in analytic thinking, the cognitive style that involves stepping back from intuitions, examining them critically, and overriding them when they conflict with evidence, are on average less likely to hold religious beliefs. This correlation is real and well replicated. But what matters for understanding deconversion specifically is not just the cognitive style itself, but the tension that builds when a person with a strongly analytic style is in a religious context that requires accepting claims on faith rather than on evidence. This tension doesn't always produce deconversion. Many people with highly analytic minds are also deeply religious, and they found frameworks, theological, philosophical, experiential, that allow those two things to coexist. What tends to produce deconversion is the specific combination of a strongly analytic mind with a religious tradition that is particularly resistant to that kind of questioning, that treats doubt as a spiritual problem rather than as a natural feature of an honest mind, and that does not provide sophisticated intellectual frameworks for engaging with the hard questions the analytic mind generates. The person who grows up in a tradition where the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, is the expected response to theological questions, and who has a mind that is constitutionally incapable of finding that response satisfying is in a situation of chronic cognitive conflict. And chronic cognitive conflict, maintained over years, tends to resolve. Either the person finds a more intellectually sophisticated expression of their faith, or the tension becomes unresolvable and the belief eventually collapses. The research also shows that the timing of this matters enormously. Exposure to serious intellectual engagement with religious questions, philosophy of religion, theology, the history of religious thought, tends to be protective against deconversion for analytically minded people, because it gives them a framework sophisticated enough to hold their questions without them destabilizing the belief entirely. The deconversions that happen fastest and most completely tend to happen to people who were in intellectually thin religious environments and who then encountered, usually in college or through the internet, intellectual critiques of religion for which their tradition had not prepared them. The fifth real reason is one that almost nobody names explicitly, and I think it's because naming it makes both sides uncomfortable in different ways. It's the gradual erosion of religious experience itself. Religious belief is not primarily a set of propositions held in the mind. It is, for most people who hold it, an experience. The experience of the presence of God in prayer, the experience of the sacred in worship, the experience of being known and loved by something beyond the human, the experience of transcendence that the religious frame makes available. These experiences are psychologically real, they are emotionally significant, and they are what makes religious belief feel like something other than simply holding a position. What the research on deconversion shows is that for many people who eventually leave religion, the process is preceded by a gradual fading of these experiences. Prayer begins to feel like talking to no one. Worship begins to feel performative rather than participatory. The sense of presence that once felt undeniable becomes harder to access, and then inaccessible, and then, in retrospect, uncertain in a way it hadn't felt before. The belief persists for a while after the experience fades, often for years, because the social and identity structures built around the belief are still intact. But without the experiential foundation, the belief becomes increasingly hollow, increasingly effortful to maintain, and increasingly vulnerable to the kinds of intellectual and social pressures that it could previously withstand, because it was grounded in something that felt directly real. The fading of religious experience is not something people talk about easily, in part because in many religious contexts it is interpreted as spiritual failure rather than as what the psychology suggests, a natural variation in the intensity of a particular kind of subjective experience that is, like most subjective experiences, subject to fluctuation rather than reliably constant. The appropriate response to the fading of religious experience from a psychological perspective is probably not to treat it as evidence that God has withdrawn, but as a shift in the experiential substrate of belief that warrants honest examination. But in many religious environments, honest examination of why the experience is fading is not a conversation that's available, which means the person faces the fading alone and often interprets it in the most destabilizing possible way. Now let me tell you what the research says about what these 5 reasons have in common, because I think the pattern is more revealing than any individual factor. Every single one of them operates primarily through emotion, relationship, and lived experience rather than through intellectual argument. The social belonging shift is relational. The unanswered prayer is experiential and emotional. The moral disillusionment is values-based. The cognitive style tension is experiential in the sense of being the lived reality of a particular kind of mind in a particular kind of environment. And the fading of religious experience is, definitionally, experiential. The intellectual arguments against religion, the ones that dominate popular debates about atheism, the arguments about evolution and cosmology, and the problem of evil and the historical reliability of religious texts almost never appear in deconversion research as primary drivers. They appear as secondary factors, as the intellectual framework people reach for to explain and justify a change that was already underway for other reasons. The person who is losing their faith because of moral disillusionment discovers the problem of evil and finds it compelling in a way they might not have before the disillusionment. The person whose social world has shifted finds themselves reading books that articulate the position their social world has normalized. The intellectual and the experiential feed each other, but the experiential almost always comes first. This has significant implications for how both religious and non-religious people understand the process of deconversion, and it's worth sitting with the implications on both sides. For religious people, the implication is that the intellectual defenses of religion, the apologetics, the philosophical arguments, the evidence for the historicity of religious claims, are less protective against deconversion than the relational, experiential, and moral quality of the religious community. A person is far more likely to maintain their faith if they are in a community that treats doubt with honesty and compassion, that models the values it preaches, that provides genuine experiences of the transcendent, and that supports meaningful relationships inside and outside the religious context, than if they are in a community with sophisticated theology but shallow moral credibility. The arguments matter less than the lived reality. For atheists, the implication is that the popular story about deconversion being primarily a matter of intellectual bravery, of following the evidence wherever it leads, of having the courage to face inconvenient truths, is largely a retrospective narrative rather than an accurate description of the actual process. Most people who become atheists did not become atheists because they read the right books or encountered the right arguments. They became atheists because of what happened to them in relationships, in communities, in the lived experience of their interior life. The intellectual framework came later and gave shape and language to something that was already emotionally and socially real. That doesn't make the intellectual position less valid. But it does mean that the "I just followed the evidence" account is often a simplified and somewhat heroic version of a process that was considerably messier, more relational, more emotionally driven, and more accidental than the telling suggests. Here's what I think is the most practically useful thing to take from this, regardless of where you personally stand. If you care about genuine understanding, whether you're religious or not, what this research points toward is that the conversation about belief and non-belief that would actually be useful is rarely the one that's happening in public. The public conversation is almost entirely intellectual, a debate about evidence and logic and philosophical argument. But the actual psychology of why people move toward or away from religious belief is almost entirely about community, experience, values, and relationship. Winning the argument changes almost nothing. Being in relationship with someone in a way that genuinely demonstrates your values changes a great deal. This is true in both directions. The most effective religious communities are not the ones with the most compelling theology. They are the ones with the most genuine sense of belonging, the most honest acknowledgement of doubt, the most visible alignment between their stated values and their lived practice. And the atheists who most effectively change minds, to the extent that changing minds is even the goal, are not the ones with the sharpest arguments. They are the ones whose lives most clearly demonstrate that a meaningful, moral, connected human existence is fully available without religious belief. Neither of those is a particularly comfortable conclusion for the people who prefer to win debates. But it is what the psychology actually shows. The Sharp Mind Blueprint is in the description and through the QR code on screen for anyone who wants to build the thinking tools to engage with exactly this kind of complexity more skillfully. 7 evidence-based systems for clearer, more precise thinking about contested topics. Take a look. Leave a comment with the reason that surprised you most, or the one that you think the research is missing. The best conversations in this comment section are always the specific ones, the ones that add something rather than just react. And subscribe and share this if someone in your life is in the middle of this question and deserves a framework more accurate than the ones that are usually offered. The real reasons why people become atheists are more human, more relational, and more emotionally honest than either side of this debate tends to admit. That's what makes them worth understanding. Let me go deeper into something that the 5 reasons I've described point toward but don't fully articulate, because I think it's the most psychologically interesting layer of this entire question. There's a concept in the psychology of religion called the plausibility structure, developed by sociologist Peter Berger, and it describes something essential about how religious belief actually works in human minds. The plausibility structure is the social and cultural environment that makes a belief feel self-evidently true rather than like something that requires active defense. When you live inside a plausibility structure, you don't experience your beliefs as beliefs in the sense of things you're choosing to hold. You experience them as the way things obviously are. The social world around you confirms them constantly, not through argument but through assumption. Everyone around you acts as if God exists. The language of the community assumes God. The rituals confirm God. The calendar is organized around God. The explanation for suffering involves God. In that environment, the belief that God exists doesn't feel like a proposition you're maintaining. It feels like the ground you're standing on. What deconversion research shows, when you look at it through this lens, is that almost every factor that drives deconversion is really a factor that disrupts the plausibility structure. Close relationships with non-believers don't primarily give you arguments against God. They give you a window into a plausibility structure that doesn't include God, and that works anyway. Moral disillusionment doesn't primarily give you reasons to doubt theology. It disrupts the social and institutional environment that made the theology feel obviously true. The fading of religious experience removes the experiential component of the plausibility structure, and cognitive style tension creates an internal disruption of the sense that the community's beliefs are self-evidently true. This reframe matters because it explains something that the "I followed the evidence" account cannot explain: why the same intellectual arguments can be entirely unconvincing to someone whose plausibility structure is intact and deeply compelling to someone whose plausibility structure has already been disrupted. It's not that the second person is smarter or more intellectually honest. It's that they are reading the argument from a different psychological position, one in which the belief no longer feels like the ground, and in which the argument therefore lands differently. This is also why deconversion so rarely works in reverse, meaning why people who have become atheists rarely return to religious belief through intellectual argument. Once the plausibility structure has collapsed, the arguments for religion that felt self-evident from inside it no longer carry the same weight. The person has seen behind the curtain, not in the sense of discovering that religion is false, but in the sense of experiencing what it feels like to be outside the social and experiential environment that made the belief feel obviously true. And that experience changes the relationship to the belief in ways that are very difficult to undo through argument alone. Reconversion, when it happens, tends to follow the same pattern as deconversion. It is driven by relationship, experience, and community, rather than by intellectual argument. People who return to religious belief after a period of atheism most commonly do so because of a profound personal experience that they find more adequately described by a religious framework than by a secular one, or because of deep involvement in a religious community that provides the social and experiential substrate for the belief to feel real again. The argument follows the experience, not the other way around. This pattern, this consistent finding that deep belief change follows experience and relationship rather than intellectual argument, has implications that go far beyond the specific question of religious belief. It tells us something general and important about how human beings actually update their most fundamental commitments. We like to think of ourselves as rational agents who hold beliefs proportionate to evidence, who update those beliefs when the evidence changes, and who arrive at our positions through a process of careful reasoning. This is a flattering picture, and it is largely inaccurate. What the psychology shows is that our deepest beliefs, the ones that organize our identity and our relationships and our sense of how the world works, are held primarily in social and experiential context, not in the mind in isolation. They change when the context changes. The intellectual narrative we construct around the change comes after the fact and gives it a shape that makes it feel more rational and more intentional than it actually was. This is not a depressing conclusion if you take it seriously rather than using it to feel superior to people whose beliefs differ from yours. It is an accurate picture of how the human mind actually works, and accurate pictures, however uncomfortable, are more useful than flattering, inaccurate ones. What it means practically is that if you want to understand why people believe what they believe, including yourself, the most productive question is not what arguments led them here, but what experiences, relationships, and community contexts made this belief feel like the obvious truth about the world. And if you want to understand why beliefs change, including your own, the same question applies in reverse. What experiences, relationships, and community shifts made the old belief feel less obviously true and the new one feel more adequately real? That's a more honest and more productive framework for thinking about belief than the debate format that dominates public conversation on this topic, which generates a lot of heat and very little genuine understanding in either direction. Now, let me address something specifically about the modern context, because the rise of internet atheism over the past 2 decades has added a new factor to the deconversion picture that wasn't present in earlier research. Before the internet, if you grew up in a religious community and began to have doubts, your experience was largely private and largely isolated. You might know one or two people who shared your doubts. You might encounter a few books. But the sense of isolation, of being the only one in your community who was questioning, was a significant break on the deconversion process. Doubts that might have crystallized into non-belief if supported by community often remained private and unresolved because the social cost of expressing them was too high and the social support for doing so was non-existent. The internet changed this completely. It made it possible to discover instantly and anonymously that thousands and then millions of other people shared your doubts, had worked through the questions you were working through, had language for experiences you were having that you didn't have words for. It created, for the first time in history, a plausibility structure for non-belief that was accessible regardless of your geographic location or your local social context. A teenager in a deeply religious small town could find, online, an entire community of thoughtful, articulate, morally serious people who did not believe in God and who were living meaningful and connected lives without it. The psychological effect of this is enormous. The research on internet-facilitated deconversion shows that online engagement with atheist and skeptic communities significantly accelerates the process for people who are already experiencing the other factors: the relationship shifts, the moral disillusionment, the fading of religious experience. It doesn't typically initiate deconversion in people whose plausibility structure is fully intact, but it dramatically accelerates and often finalizes the process for people whose plausibility structure has already been disrupted by the other factors. This is why rates of religious non-belief have risen so much faster among younger generations than older ones. It is not primarily that younger people are smarter or more intellectually honest. It is that they grew up with access to an alternative plausibility structure, available at all times through the device in their pocket, in a way that no previous generation did. The flip side of this, and it's worth acknowledging because the research supports it, is that the online atheist community has also developed some of the features of the religious communities it emerged from, including in-group solidarity, out-group hostility, moral hierarchies, and the treatment of certain intellectual positions as sacred and beyond questioning. The irony of communities organized around skepticism developing orthodoxies of their own is not lost on researchers who study these dynamics, and it points again to the underlying principle. The social and community functions that religion serves are needs, not artifacts of religion specifically. When the religious container is removed, those needs find new containers. Let me close with the question that I think this research ultimately points toward, because I think it's more important than any of the specific findings. If the real reasons why people become atheists are primarily relational, experiential, and social, rather than intellectual, and if the same is true for why people become or remain religious, then what are we actually debating when we debate religion and atheism in the public sphere? We're debating intellectual positions. We're arguing about evidence and logic and philosophy. And the research suggests that almost nobody who genuinely changes their deepest beliefs does so primarily because of intellectual debate. That doesn't mean the intellectual questions don't matter. They matter to me, and they probably matter to most people watching this. But it does mean that the debate format, the winner-takes-all, argument as the primary mechanism model that dominates public conversation about religion and atheism, is not particularly well suited to the actual psychology of how this kind of belief change happens. It produces understanding primarily for people who are already in the process of change for other reasons. For everyone else, it mostly confirms existing positions more strongly. What would actually produce understanding on both sides is what this research points toward. honest engagement with the experiential, relational, and moral dimensions of both religious and non-religious life. What does it feel like from the inside to live with or without religious belief? What needs does belief meet, and what secular alternatives exist for meeting those same needs? What does moral life actually look like without a divine framework, and what does it actually look like within one? Those conversations are more uncomfortable than debates about evidence. They're also more likely to produce genuine mutual understanding rather than just louder disagreement. The real reasons why people become atheists are human reasons. The same kinds of forces, relationship, experience, community, moral integrity, or its absence that drive every other significant change in how people understand the world. Recognizing that doesn't resolve the question of whether they're right, but it does make the conversation about that question considerably more honest than it usually is. There's one more dimension of this I want to address, and it's the one that tends to generate the most defensiveness on both sides because it implicates everyone's self-understanding, not just their conclusions. The research on deconversion, taken together, suggests something that is deeply uncomfortable for the way most people like to think about their own beliefs. That the process by which we arrive at our most fundamental convictions is largely invisible to us while it's happening, and that the account we give of that process afterward is largely a reconstruction that emphasizes the rational and intentional elements while minimizing the accidental, emotional, and social ones. This is not a phenomenon unique to religion. The psychology of belief formation and revision shows the same pattern across domains. Political beliefs, moral beliefs, beliefs about health and medicine, beliefs about economics and social organization. We arrive at our positions through a complex mixture of cognitive style, social influence, personal experience, and the emotional residue of specific moments and relationships. And we then construct a narrative about how we arrived there that emphasizes the part that sounds most rational, most intentional, most reflective of who we like to think we are. For atheists, the narrative tends to emphasize intellectual honesty, evidence following, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. For religious people, it tends to emphasize genuine experience of the divine, the wisdom of tradition, and the transformative power of faith. Both narratives contain truth. Neither captures the full, messy reality of how the actual process unfolded. What I find most interesting about this is not the implication that everyone is wrong, which would be too simple. It's the implication that everyone is more similar in their psychology than the content of their beliefs suggests. The religious person and the atheist both arrived at their positions through processes that were primarily emotional and relational. Both constructed intellectual frameworks around positions that were already emotionally held. Both experience their beliefs as more chosen and more rationally grounded than the psychology suggests they actually are. Both are members of communities that confirm and stabilize their worldview in ways that feel like the obvious truth of things rather than like social construction. This similarity is not a reason to conclude that all beliefs are equally valid, which would be a non sequitur. It is a reason to hold your own position with slightly more epistemic humility and to engage with the positions of others with slightly more genuine curiosity about the experience and the relationships and the moments that produce them rather than primarily as intellectual errors to be corrected. That epistemic humility is, ironically, more consistently present in the research on deconversion and religious belief than in most of the public debates about these topics. The researchers who study this tend to be genuinely curious about the psychology rather than invested in a particular outcome. That curiosity, applied to questions this large and this personal, tends to produce more understanding than the confidence that drives most of the shouting. Now, the practical question: what do you do with all of this? If you are religious and you're watching this because you're trying to understand someone in your life who has left faith, The most useful thing this research tells you is to stop trying to win the intellectual argument. The intellectual argument almost certainly isn't what produced the deconversion, which means the intellectual counter-argument almost certainly isn't what will reverse it. What the research suggests might actually matter is the quality of the relationship you maintain with that person, your willingness to engage honestly with the questions they're raising rather than treating the questions themselves as the problem, and the degree to which you can demonstrate through your own life that the values you associate with your faith are genuinely operative rather than performative. If you are an atheist and you're watching this because you want to understand your own deconversion more accurately, or because you're curious about how to talk to religious people in your life, the most useful thing this research tells you is that the intellectual arguments you find compelling are probably less central to your own position than you think, and are probably less likely to be useful in conversation with religious people than you hope. The shared values, the honest questions, the genuine curiosity about each other's experience, those are the things that actually move people when anything does. If you are somewhere in the middle, in the process of the kind of transition this video has been describing, the most useful thing might simply be to know that what you're experiencing is a documented, understood, extensively researched human process, and that the experience of it being emotionally driven and socially influenced rather than purely rational is not a flaw in your process. It is the normal human way that beliefs of this magnitude actually change. The real reasons why people become atheists are the human reasons. They are the same kinds of forces that shape every significant shift in how human beings understand themselves and their world. Understanding that makes the conversation about it more honest, and more honest conversations are the ones worth having. Leave a comment with the reason that most accurately describes someone you know, or your own experience if that's part of your story. I read them, and the specific ones always produce the most interesting follow-up conversations. Subscribe if you want more of this. Share it with someone who's navigating this question and deserves a more accurate map of what they're actually going through. And the link for the Sharp Mind Blueprint is still in the description and through the QR code on screen for anyone who wants to build the cognitive tools to engage with exactly this kind of complexity with more precision and less heat. The reasons are human. The conversation should be too. One thing I haven't addressed yet that the research raises and that I think deserves explicit attention: the role of religious trauma in deconversion and why it's both real and more complicated than it's usually presented. The concept of religious trauma syndrome, while not a formal DSM diagnosis, describes something that researchers and therapists working with former religious believers consistently encounter: the lasting psychological harm that can result from certain kinds of religious upbringing or religious community experience. This includes exposure to doctrines of eternal punishment that produce genuine fear and anxiety in children who take them seriously, shame-based approaches to sexuality and body that produce lasting damage to self-concept and intimate relationships, environments where questioning is treated as spiritual failure or even as demonic influence, and the use of community shunning or ostracism as a response to belief change or moral transgression. These experiences are real. The psychological harm they produce is documented, and they are genuine contributors to deconversion for a subset of people who leave religion. When someone leaves religion primarily because of religious trauma, the process has a different psychological character than the other reasons we've described. It involves not just the loss of a belief system, but the need to actively heal from experiences that caused harm in the context of that belief system. And the healing often requires, before anything else, simply having the harm acknowledged as harm rather than as spiritual correction or as a misunderstanding of what genuine religion is. However, and this is where the complication enters, The concept of religious trauma has, in some online communities, expanded considerably beyond what the clinical research supports. It is sometimes used to describe any discomfort produced by religious upbringing, any sense of guilt associated with religious moral frameworks, any experience of religious belief that later felt confining or limiting. Used at that level of breadth, the concept loses its clinical precision and becomes a framework that pathologizes ordinary religious experience rather than identifying genuine harm. The distinction matters because it affects both the person going through it and the quality of the public conversation about religion. Genuine religious trauma deserves genuine clinical attention and genuine compassion from religious communities who care about honesty. The expansion of the concept to cover all religious discomfort does neither. It doesn't serve the people with genuine trauma by diluting the specificity of what they experienced, and it doesn't serve the broader conversation by treating normal religious moral formation as inherently harmful. What the research actually shows is that outcomes for people raised in religious environments vary enormously depending on the specific character of that environment. Religious upbringings characterized by authoritarian control, shame-based enforcement of norms, fear-based theology, and social ostracism as a tool of compliance do produce measurable harm across multiple psychological dimensions. Religious upbringings characterized by warmth, genuine community, honest engagement with doubt, and values-based rather than fear-based moral formation are associated with positive psychological outcomes that persist even in people who eventually leave the faith as adults. The variable isn't religion, it's the specific character of the religious environment, and particularly whether it treats the people inside it as ends in themselves or as means to institutional ends. This is worth knowing because it means the question, is religious upbringing harmful, does not have a single answer. It depends on which religion, which community, which approach, and which specific doctrines and practices the child was exposed to. And it means that the appropriate response to religious trauma is not, religion is harmful, but these specific kinds of religious environments are harmful, and here is what makes them so. That more precise claim is more honest, more useful for the people who experienced harm, and more productive for the communities who want to avoid causing it. The real reasons why people become atheists, taken all together, paint a picture of a profoundly human process. Social belonging shifts, unanswered prayer in moments of crisis, moral disillusionment with religious communities, cognitive style in tension with epistemic expectations, the fading of religious experience, the disruption of the plausibility structure that made belief feel self-evident, religious trauma in the cases where that's part of the story, and the accelerating role of the internet in providing an alternative plausibility structure that previous generations didn't have access to. None of these reasons is primarily intellectual. All of them are primarily human. And understanding them as human reasons, rather than as either intellectual failures or spiritual ones, is the beginning of a conversation about this topic that is honest enough to be genuinely useful. I'll see you in the next one.